Thank you, MH. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone to today's webinar entitled Agile Release Planning by Example. At the conclusion of the live presentation, participants will receive an email with links to the recording and copies of the slides. We'll reserve time at the end to answer your questions, but please submit your questions online throughout the presentation using the GoToWebinar function on your screen. Now a little about our presenters. Brian Stallings leads the efforts of our professional services consulting team to maximize the benefits that Agile methods present to our software development and Agile consulting clients. He's an experienced leader of Agile adoption initiatives, both as a consultant and as an internal change advocate. Valerie Morris is a Scrum Master and Agile coach with over 20 years of experience in software development as an analyst and project manager. She consults with our enterprise clients and helps them adopt Agile and scale it throughout their organizations. And with that, I'll leave it up to Brian and Valerie.
Good morning. I look forward to this webinar because we're going to be talking about one of the topics that I find clients are most interested in. You know, release planning can be complex and challenging for teams. It's something that you often don't learn about in basic Scrum or Agile training courses, and it becomes a challenge when teams attempt this on their own. So we put together some material today that will allow us to discuss with you some of the tips that we use when we facilitate this with our customers, and a lot of images and discussions about how does this happen in the real world. So if you look at this puzzle, we're going to use this throughout the webinar to talk about where we're at in the discussion. And I think this is a good visual for the topics that we'll discuss, because bringing all of these pieces together are really the critical aspects of preparing for a webinar. I'm sorry, for release planning. You know, as I was thinking about this morning, we're going to talk about facilitating release planning, and to me it started to make sense that the role that you play as you bring a release planning event together for teams is really like that of a producer. You have a lot of moving parts that you have to bring together. We'll be talking about what is the purpose of release planning, who are the roles that are involved, what is it like and what does it feel like when you're there running the event or as a participant in the event. We'll talk about the intended outcomes of the event and how do you track the plan that you created as you move forward into the project. We'll be discussing all of those preparations and timing aspects of the event so that you can bring it all together successfully. So as we talk about this as a challenge, what you're attempting to do is plan beyond a single iteration. You're trying to bring together multiple teams at times, or plan into the future beyond just what we've been trained to do when it comes to sprint planning, for example. So I think it's important at the outset to consider, as we consider the purpose of the event, that it's not a meeting with a defined start and end time. It's not really driven by an agenda at all times. It's a working session that bring a lot of teams together, and so it may seem at times that there's a bit of chaos that's happening in this event. It'll be, for some teams, very busy at times as they try to bring their planning up to a specific point so they can integrate with others. And yet for those others who may be already prepared, it'll seem like there may be times that are slow. So as a facilitator in this event, it becomes important to communicate this up front and help the teams understand how to best be prepared. So the release planning process is really key and important in Agile teams. What happens in this event is really a product owner driven process where you're starting to talk about what's going to be developed in the longer time frame, and it becomes a key aspect of planning strategically where this project's going to go and how it fits into the work of all of those involved. It's going to require the whole team to participate in how much they may be able to develop in an acceptable time frame and what it's going to take to bring all of that work together. And we use this as a baseline to communicate where we're at versus where we expect it to be, and to prepare a plan that the whole organization can understand. You know, as you plan within a Scrum project, you are very accustomed to looking at the near term, what's happening in the next few weeks, for example. But too often teams don't get a good picture of the whole, what it is that we're going to be accomplishing over months worth of work, for example. And so release planning really serves to put those guideposts in front of the teams about what's going to be happening in that longer term. How do you link those iterations together? And what is it that the team believes is probable that they could do in the future release? So some of the goals for release planning are laid out here. One of them that's listed here at the bottom that I think becomes really important is how release planning serves as a forcing function to pull together a lot of the planning aspects of the team. For example, you may be waiting to get a full backlog fleshed out, but when you have this event and everybody is coming together for the purpose of doing the release planning, then having the full backlog prepared becomes critical. So prepping for this event forces that to occur. One of the key goals here is really allowing the organization to align itself between what we lay out in a vision or roadmap about where we want to go with this product, and align that with what the team expects they're able to accomplish from the bottom up as they talk about where they're going with the project and at what pace they can accomplish the work. So you may have a product owner who's saying, here's where I want us to be, and a team who's saying, here's how quickly we can proceed through that content or that development. And those can be completely out of sync. And so release planning brings the process into alignment where we can talk about going beyond this single sprint, how much do we expect to be able to accomplish? And then that creates a sense of visibility that our leadership within the organizations can use as they make planning decisions. And it brings into alignment this picture about all that needs to be accomplished in order to deliver something complex. Now, as far as what you want to accomplish by the end, exit criteria, you're looking to put together a plan that allows the whole organization to understand what sort of commitments or forecasts they might be able to make. These few bullet points actually come from a meeting purpose that we're going to show you in a minute as you think about what can we accomplish in release planning. You want to make that agreement. You want to be able to communicate and create that visibility with the other that you're delivering with, your dependent teams, for example, or operational teams. You want to identify key risk factors, and that's a large part of what happens at release planning. And it enables the organization to make better decisions about how to support the team in being successful. So some of the outcomes are listed. What we've discussed already is backlog readiness, which is key, and the ability for the team to comprehend the entirety of what's being built. You find that organizations and participants leave release planning with a solid understanding of, maybe for the first time, having planned together with maybe other teams that they're delivering with or dependent teams about what it's going to take to get this product released. And this serves as a foundation between those different parts of the organization about where we're going to get to and what's necessary to accomplish that and how do we plan for those actions. Creates a sense of collective ownership and commitment to what needs to be accomplished. So thinking about when is the right time to do release planning, this slide pulls together an aspect of planning that we often discuss in introducing teams to Agile, this multi-level planning framework where you, as I mentioned, you're bringing together the top-down planning of an organization through vision and road mapping with the bottom-up efforts of teams as they talk about, here's what we're doing every day, here's what we're doing every sprint. And release planning really serves to lace those two together, the strategic with what the team can tactically accomplish, to get that alignment nailed down. So the right time to have release planning is when you're looking forward into the release and you have several sprints worth of backlog that you're prepared. I find that I want to accomplish this with all the teams I work on, and it generally takes 3 to 4 sprints worth of work so that the team has a decent track record that they could start to forecast their pace or their velocity, as we call it. And we want to schedule an event so that we can put a couple of days on the calendar to involve all of these people. We're going to show you a couple of them coming up where bringing together that many teams and dependents functions, we had to plan a month or two in advance in order to pull it all together. So we'll be talking about both that type of a complex release planning, as well as what does it look like when it's just a single team. So I want to keep this model in our heads as we talk about this process, because release planning is really, it's going to form part of this iterative planning cycle that occurs on teams. If you consider how this cycle progresses, you're going to be planning and then replanning, as we discussed. So let's start in this upper right hand where we talk about, all right, we're going to either start to plan for the first time, or maybe we just completed a release, and so we need to update our release planning for what's coming next. Then we proceed into that cycle. We're going to do some work in a sprint, and then with that result, that really represents reality. We can compare that result to our plan. So how have we progressed versus what we planned? And we want to keep that up to date, so we'll be able to monitor our plan and talk about, are we ahead or behind of where we thought we'd be. Given that outcome, we then need to take an action, either inform our organization, our sponsors, and others that we're on track, or that we've had issues, that there's impediments, we want to escalate those. And we should be able to ask along the way, are we able to release? Is this the right time? And if not, then we're going to proceed to update our plan and do this cycle after cycle with every sprint, so that we can keep and update those commitments that we've created. So, Valerie, why don't you talk to us a little bit about how we prepare for release planning?
Okay, thanks, Brian. We've talked a little bit about the goals and kind of setting the context around that it's not a meeting, that it's more of an event and a gathering of stakeholders and team members. When we start working with our product owners in companies, we tend to use this example of questions to help them prepare, and how do they know they're prepared going into this type of event. So some of the key questions have to do around, do you have a certain theme or goal that you're targeting for this release? Do we know the velocities? Do we have definitions of done? What about the product backlog? Items like that. When you start asking these questions to some of your stakeholders, you tend to find that the answers are, I don't know. So what we like to do in that prep time of 1 to 2 months, depending on if it's a single team or a multi-team type planning session, is have time to answer these questions with the appropriate stakeholders. Having these things will start to tell you how successful, if you're ready to go into release planning or not. This is an example, a photo showing a product owner. He's in a very large room. You can see that the wall has a lot of space. Those items that are lined up with the white cards and the pink cards that you'll see on your screen with some yellow stickies as well, those represent the product backlog and acceptance criteria. It's a good idea 1 to 2 days before the event to lay out, what does that backlog look like? We want to make sure that everyone has seen the backlog, has had a chance to look at it, to size it, to estimate it, especially the top part, because that's the part we're going to be addressing first in the release. And that way the product owner is very familiar as trade-offs may need to occur during the meeting. The product vision is something that should be very visible to everyone in the room when you come together. This is the product vision that helps the teams understand what we're building and why we're building it. Several times in a multi-team planning event, you'll find that they are so focused on maybe their vertical or their theme, if you will, that they lose sight of the bigger goal of the product. So having the product vision created before you get into the meeting, either on a plotter or a flip chart or a whiteboard, something that makes it visible, helps everyone see in front of them what we're all trying to accomplish with this release. And the vision can help when making trade-off decisions later on in the meeting. Another example of a big visible chart is having the product roadmap there. The roadmap is a visual laid out by time scale that helps us put our product vision kind of across, how would we do this? How do we get this done? It helps us see what are some of the features, the key goals, the key themes, and it's something that teams can start to relate to from a timing perspective. If you've gone to product owner training or Scrum training, you might have heard that as part of the multi-level planning that the roadmap is updated 3 to 4 times a year. This is just a recommendation. This is not a hard and fast rule. As we talked about earlier, we're planning so that we can replan based on information that we learn. The trade-off matrix is something that comes from Jim Highsmith. He's done a lot of work with Agile project management, and the purpose of this is for everyone at the gathering, the event, to really understand what is the critical aspect of this release. This conversation, I think, is one of the most critical conversations you can have at the beginning of the event. You'll have people there, different stakeholders representing aspects of scope. Maybe you've got some management leadership there representing dollars. And when you ask the question in the room of, okay, what item do we want to say is fixed? You'll get, an array of answers based on who the stakeholders are. This sparks a great conversation that helps us get to the point of, again, laying that foundation of what is our critical trade-offs and what things are not trade-offs. A meeting purpose is something that helps us know what are we trying to accomplish with this meeting and when will we know we're done. So when you meet your meeting purpose during the event, that's how you know you're done. It's not a time-boxed meeting. You're done when you're done. So if you can create the meeting purpose ahead of time prior to the session with maybe a smaller set of stakeholders, the product owner, leadership, etc., you can come to agreement so that the expectation is set of what we're trying to accomplish by getting together and having this 1 or 2 day event together as a company. And then it's always good to have an agenda for folks in the room, because most of us work in companies where we go to meetings and we have a best practice of meeting etiquette that says always have an agenda. So in doing that, this agenda is really more about setting the stage of collaboration, not time-based activities. So what happens is you create this agenda with some high-level activities that will occur throughout the day, but they don't have times with them because you can't really predict what is going to come about from an emerging standpoint based on some of these topics here. Some of the topics have to do with going over the product vision, going over what are some of the team velocities, going over issues and risks and things like that. You can't predict when are we going to be done with that. So the agenda is just to help people see the types of activities that you'll be doing together, but it's not necessarily time-based. And then we have a working agreement. The example you'll see here on the slide is ground rules. This example says ground rules because we had a client that didn't like the term working agreement. Again, make it what it needs to be for your situation. But basically, a working agreement or ground rules are the norms of the event that help guide everyone towards successful collaboration. And then velocity. If you have a single team, you might have a similar chart like this that might show velocity over the last few sprints, and you can get an idea of this is what we're trending towards. We're going to go with an average here. You want to be realistic. Don't be optimistic and say, well, I know that we've, at one point we achieved a really high velocity and then our last few have been lower. Go with what's real. Don't go with where you just want to be. If you have a multi-team planning function, everybody will have different velocities. You want to continue the best practice of not comparing teams. It's not a competition when teams bring forecasts of their velocities. It's a data point that's going to help us later in the event as far as planning out when we can do certain things across the various teams. So with that, Brian, why don't you talk about maybe some of the rules?
All right, so as we think about release planning and who we need to have involved, it can be different in every case and what we're trying to plan for. So I think one of the key questions is listed here. Who do we need here in order to achieve the commitment and the decisions that are necessary? So you need to plan through that. I'm not suggesting you send out engraved invitations, but you need to plan for who needs to be there. Both who needs to be there and who needs to be available in case questions come up, and how do we reach out to those parties, have them available for access at a moment's notice. So whoever is going to torpedo the plan or potentially be critical of the plan is best to involve as well and plan with those individuals in advance. So you definitely want to have your Scrum team there. Product owner, of course, is the one who leads and has prepared for this event. I like to involve management, and in particular at the right time in the meeting. They may be at the beginning of the meeting, and if they're unable to stay and participate effectively throughout because of other commitments or maybe personal style, I like to involve them again towards the end of each day so that they can understand what's been accomplished and where we're at in getting to that commitment that we're trying to establish with the teams. Other subject matter experts should be there. Maybe they're not on the teams, but they can help the team as critical decisions come up. A lot of these may be outside the room part of the time, but we've got an agreement that within so much time we can pull them into the meeting when a question arises. Other specialty roles like architects in helping the team make the right decisions. Operations is a key aspect of this planning as well, because at some point the team needs to hand off the software to those who can implement it or those who are going to test it, depending upon the specific process that may exist within an organization. So you want to think about who needs to be involved, and also think about who needs to be involved in the preparations so that alignment's there and so that you've sort of highlighted what this plan is going to be like and previewed it with those who may have a role or who may have concerns. Now, thinking about how all of these parties come together and participate, in order to communicate that, we've put together this RACI chart. If you're familiar with responsible, accountable, consulted, informed, is sort of how this grid lays out. And we've laid it out across all aspects of this multi-level planning framework that I brought up earlier. So how do these different roles participate, and how are they involved? And also this is intended to help us think about planning beyond release planning and all of that you need to have in readiness to communicate those different planning levels. It also sets up a framework for teams to participate in an empowered way. What is their role, and how do they take a leadership aspect in the planning process themselves? So you'll see that release planning involves the chief product owner, who's fully accountable for a successful event. If you've got multiple teams, or if it's a single team, you'll have that product owner for that team who will take that role. And then you've involved the executives, scrum masters, teams, and other stakeholders who would be consulted in bringing that meeting together. Now, I want to talk a little bit about preparation, as we come to sort of the wrap-up about that topic. So we've been discussing how to prepare, and this slide's sort of to talk about some of the warnings that we might have. It's not possible to plan for everything. You're going to find some surprises, absolutely. Some of the key surprises that I believe always will occur is that there's going to be some stories or some product backlog items as you lay out the backlog and start to work it with the team that are going to be missing. You're not going to have been able to think about everything. The teams are going to find that they identified some stories that they need to add. So you'll get those handwritten and added in there. You're going to find that as multiple teams work together, they're going to realize, hey, where's that thing that you're going to do that connects into what we're doing? And the other team will say, we thought you were doing that. And so nobody has conceived of those requirements. And so you're going to want to put them and bring them out. You'll find that you need to adjust acceptance criteria, add some, negotiate and discuss what's the right way to implement different features. You're going to need to update estimates as you learn more information. What's critical is, although a lot will emerge and things will be found, you've got the right people there, and you've planned so that you can derive a solution for those surprises without a lot of delay, because everybody who can assist with that has been involved. So prepare yourself and the group to be surprised. And I would say if you're doing more than just a small team, you need to ensure that you're not facilitating alone. For me, that's one of the key preparations, is to be prepared with others so that I can continue to facilitate the event and have someone else there with me who can take care of some of these surprises. Be prepared for the politics as well. For me, it's best to prepare with individuals that may inject sort of those political challenges by highlighting to them how they can support this process. And we've got some information coming up about that. You can also be certain that certain things are possible and that you are going to be able to do. As I mentioned, you can prepare to have subject matter experts available to pull in at short notice if something emerges, if a surprise occurs. And also, don't overlook the need to have the right supplies. If you're planning and you've got everything up on the wall and your sticky notes start to fall off, or you're missing the tape that you were going to use, or whatever facilitation aspect is missing, you'll have those challenges as well. So I'd just like to know that everything's there so that we can proceed. So we're going to walk you through sort of how this meeting progresses now with some slides and examples, and Valerie's going to talk about that. You'll notice that we've used real-life situations, real teams, and you may not recognize some of these faces because we've blurred them out to make these slides shareable. Valerie, you want to walk us through this?
Sure. So we spent a lot of this webinar talking about the prep instead of the actual meeting itself, and the reason for that is because without the proper amount of prep and focus on that, the event will not be successful. So we're going to go through these slides probably rather quickly because a lot of them are about stories and visuals. So when we open the meeting, but following our agenda that we set earlier, you'll see you do your standard welcoming. You want to welcome everyone that's there, especially if people have traveled to this event. You want to highlight that. If you have executive leadership available to make some type of opening comments about why this is important and the value of everyone coming together, that is always a morale booster for these types of meetings. Then you want to walk the walls and review the meeting purpose and talk about why is this room decorated with all this paper and what does all of it mean. So walking the room and talking about here's the backlog, here's our trade-off matrix, here's issues and risks, all of these types of visible charts so that people can start to get familiar with their surroundings and start to see that this is not going to be your standard meeting type situation. After you do that, it's always good to review the working agreement, see if there are any changes or additions, and then we get started. So how do we get started? Well, we start talking about teams getting together as teams. If you are using a single team approach, it's very simple because it's all the team members that are there. So you get together and you review your definition of done. And the reason that you're doing this is that you want to start to think about what have we done the previous sprints or the previous releases, and how do we want to take changes from the retrospectives that we've had and put them in place and have a change this time with the upcoming sprints and release. If you have multi-team situation in the room, have everybody break up into their own teams and have this discussion, come back together and do kind of a readout. And then when we start to look at how can we get to some common understandings across teams for definitions of done, especially if they have to work together across those different pieces of functionality that Brian mentioned. The next thing is people will bring in key dates. It's always good to have a calendar. We have two different examples. One, the left side, we did an example where we wrote down all the dates for the months that we were talking about for the release. We looked at what are the holidays coming up in there. This was a team that had multiple countries, so we looked at what are the Mexican holidays, Mexico's holidays, what are India's holidays, as well as United States. The other side, we started with more of a work back schedule where we wrote down dates on stickies, and then we applied them in more of a timeline scenario on a wall. These are an example of a multi-team planning event. You'll see on the wall there are several rows kind of like swim lanes, if you're familiar with that term, that line up. Those are the backlogs. The multiple lanes represent multiple teams. So you have people start going to the walls. Everybody gets up. This is a very interactive event. So everybody will get out of their chair. They will go up to the wall based on teams, and they will start looking at what is it that they can pull in from their velocity standpoint and start doing in the very first sprints. So what they start doing is they start saying, oh, this fits with us either because of our scope or expertise, or I just really like it and this is what we want to work on. We had a situation where we said we had one single backlog. You'll see the picture on the left. It starts out as one backlog. The picture on the right was after teams, I'll use the term, rushed the wall. They all got up, they went to the wall, they picked what they wanted to pick, then they started building out what their specific teams' backlogs, if you will, started to look like. This is a picture of the product owners meeting with the team to talk about acceptance criteria. Whenever you're a product owner and you write your product backlog items, it makes perfect sense to you. You come in, you write your acceptance criteria, you know exactly what you want to get done. However, then you start having a conversation with the team members, and they have questions about, well, what about if you did it like this, or did you think about this, or we did this before? This is where some of the conversation and negotiation starts to happen, and you want to make sure that you have the space and the time for people to have that dialogue. That's why the white pieces of paper have a lot of different colored stickies on them. People have added things, made changes, noted if there were different dependencies associated with certain stories, the ops, the testing, etc. This is an example of how we start to look at where are our sprint boundaries or our iteration boundaries. So we start to look at all the stories. The white papers are stories. They have sizing estimates on them. A team will look at that and they will add up what their velocity is per sprint, and they will say, okay, here's where, in this case, sprint 11 is, and where it ends, and here's where sprint 12 starts. So you start to see that stories get lined up in priority order, and we start to see them marked by sprint boundaries, if you will. Now, Brian, I think there are things that probably emerge during all this. It doesn't go as smooth as everything gets lined up on a wall. So what can you tell us about some of the implications?
Right, so as you start to walk the wall with that, let's call it a yardstick of team's velocity, you can start to look forward into the plan. You've got your calendar on the wall, and you've also had your trade-off matrix discussion, and you know that either this is a date-driven or maybe there's a certain set of features that have to be done. And you can start to compare those to the time scale, and that's when reality comes crashing down many times on teams about, wow, if this is true, then here are these implications. Either we're feeling pretty good or we just realize we're going to fail. And so we call that failing fast. All right, so here's the reality you're facing. Now this is really where the team and the leadership and the facilitator earn their money on that day. What are we going to do about this? How are we going to optimize this outcome? Or who do we need to communicate this reality to? So it's really a reality versus what the plan is going to be that needs to happen. And so you'll see, and you need to facilitate those discussions and negotiations. Oftentimes it's a conversation about how do we proceed more rapidly, what are the impediments that are in the way, and how could resolving those improve the outcome. Also, what's on the backlog that could be eliminated? What strategies could we use in order to refine this so that we can get to an acceptable outcome? And so these trade-off decisions are really where the meat and the value of this conversation happens. Here's some examples as these teams pull together their backlogs and they start to align those dependencies and you know, who's going to do what and how we're going to get this accomplished. You start to see teams identifying those key dates, those integration aspects and dependencies that are going to help them to deliver together. Also, here's a couple of examples. I'm going to show you one. This is a single team who's planning through the release process. They've got their stories prepared, they've been estimated, and they've started to lay them out based on how much they can accomplish in any given iteration. They've laid out dates for start and end points of each iteration, and they've started to forecast about how many iterations are going to be necessary. And as we talked about, this is a plan. This is a team looking to say, here's what we believe is possible. Nobody's binding these and actually creating sprint expectations from that day so early in advance, but the teams will plan again as they come into each of these sprints. Here's an example of multiple teams coming together to plan. They've got, as you can see, a number of teams, each with a swim lane, talking about what they believe they can accomplish in each of these iterations. And well, the photo's not wide enough to show that it actually wraps around and continues on the next wall. You can see all of the ad hoc additions that have come in to make this plan, with sticky notes and adjusted stories and handwritten notes as the teams plan and prepare together. This is a key aspect of why we do this in person with physical tools, because so many threads of conversation and activity can occur at once. So as we wrap things up, we've been pulling together data from the group throughout the session onto some of these big visible charts, and we're going to walk these through. Do you want to share these with us, Valerie?
Sure. So when we have our big visible charts in the room, we don't stop and necessarily ask people, what are all the issues that you can think of? These are happening organically throughout the process, throughout the event. We're gathering these things usually on a flip chart or a wall if it's designated for, certain areas of risks and issues, etc. What you want to do is make sure and capture all the items that you can in the event, because what you want to do as part of the wrap-up, after you come to the point of seeing these backlogs along the wall where the teams feel that they can go and implement what they've marked by the sprint boundaries, what you want to do is you want to start looking at where can we make action plans to start addressing some of these high risk items as well as the pressing issues. So some of the project management functionality, responsibilities that you would do to close out this meeting is any good house cleaning type process, which is don't leave issues without action around them hanging on a flip chart. You might see a list of decisions that have been made. So sometimes we'll have a conversation, especially about certain issues if it comes up, and when we bring the group back together, if it's a multi-team planning event or if it's a single team planning event, they may have a side conversation for quite a long time about a specific issue. At the end of that, if there is a resolution, a decision made, maybe you had to go get certain stakeholders that are outside the room to be part of that conversation, it's a useful thing to capture those as well and to put them on a wall, on a flip chart that's very visible to everyone. Then, as I stated before, the action item list is something that is living and breathing throughout the entire event, and especially at the end. When you leave this event, there's been such a huge amount of conversation and collaboration that people have said, oh, we need to do this. Oh, make sure that we follow up on this. What you don't want to do is have an empty action item that doesn't have an owner or a date. So what we recommend is having the 3 headings along the top of a flip chart, the what, which is the action that you want to do, who's going to do it, and when are they going to have it done by. This not only helps the meeting organizer see that there's going to be follow-through, but it also helps individuals know what they're signing up to do and when they're signing up to do it for. And then the last thing that you're going to probably do as far as the teams and this process of the release planning event itself is get team commitment. We have 3 different photos here representing a single team as well as multiple teams. The 2 multiple team photos I want to bring up also had release planning done in multiple locations. You'll see the monitors, maybe you can see that on your screen behind them, representing those folks that aren't necessarily in the room, but they're also committing with the team. And what does it mean to commit? It means that we're all on the same page. We've made a plan collectively that we feel that we can go out and actually follow through on. This is where we also have all the action items identified, the issues, action, risk ready to go as far as what to do with those. We don't just leave those out there. And the team feels like they were part of the process. Release planning is really about having the conversations of listening to each other and other people's opinions and other people's processes so that we can come together and deliver this as one big team, not just individual Scrum teams.
It's interesting, this photo, Valerie. You've got an example of some teams committing together with folks participating from remote sites by a webinar. It's kind of cool. All right, so as we close, as a facilitator, what we want to do is walk the walls with the group. And so we're talking about clearing out a lot of these big visible charts that we've been using to collect information and discussing what the plan is as we proceed and how we wrap and finalize a lot of the discussions. Sort of ensuring that everybody who is participating in separate team or disparate conversations hears the story as you pull it all together. Then one of the next steps is to have a retrospective about how this event went. As you do that, you'll be talking about how we're going to communicate out what happens in this meeting and who's going to participate in that, and how do we ensure that these messages about what's been decided and discussed here gets carried back to others that are involved. As you reflect on the meeting, you want to get the participants involved, talking about how did this work. And you can use your standard retrospective techniques. Generally, these are larger groups, so you want to pull everybody together, talk about what worked well, talk about what could have been different and better, and congratulate everybody on the successful outcome. I think that besides a retrospective of the participants in this meeting, if you've been planning and involving other stakeholders in this, you also want to go away later after the event, hold a retrospective about how did our preparations work out, what else would we want to do next time, and discuss in detail the outcomes versus what was prepared. So when you leave this release planning event, you've now got this plan. It's forecasted into the future. It's a single point in time of what we believe is our best case. And as soon as you go do work on any of these teams that have been planning, things will change. And so you really need a process to maintain the release plan, because you planned in a sense in the face of uncertainty, and as you unravel day by day what's going to happen on these teams, the reality is going to come into play and things will change. So you've got to have some metrics in place and a process to track reality against that baseline that was planned, and then be able to communicate those differences or when things are on track. So that's why we talk about the importance of making and updating those forecasted commitments, and the importance of transparency that is going to lead to the ability to really understand where we're at and know that there is a trust environment. One aspect of planning that can happen after the meeting that I believe is important is something we call the meta scrum. There's a link on one of the last slides of the presentation to a white paper written about meta scrum. Some of the metrics that I think are important can all be rolled up into a couple of simple charts, and I've shown one here of a hand-drawn one as well as one that you could create in something like Excel, or some of the popular tools provide these already. Really what you've got here is how is the team progressing towards a complete scope. So you see this top line representing the product backlog scope, how many points, let's say this is user story points, are in the expected release. You can see that that's adjusting, and how many cumulative points have the team or teams pulled through the sprint process to get to done. Now, one last topic is prepping all of these different roles to support release planning. And there's some guidelines on this slide about how do you work with the teams to know what to expect. How do you help the product owner to be prepared? What about management? How do we brief them about what to expect and how they can help or hinder the success of this outcome? And then some guidelines to all participants that I use when we kick off a release planning event. How can they be successful? How might they need to receive coaching if they aren't participating effectively, and how can the facilitator help with that, and get everybody committed to a successful event. So these are sort of our tips as we prepare for release planning.
We are going to take questions in a minute, but for those of you who might not know Solutions IQ, with more than 30 years of experience, we have a deep understanding of software delivery excellence. Our broad range of consulting services, from training and coaching and talent acquisition services to total outsourced development, gives customers the tools and collaboration they need to succeed. Solutions IQ is uniquely equipped to help organizations leverage modern Agile project management and software development methods to deliver solutions more reliably, with less risk and at a lower cost. To learn more about us, please visit www.solutionsiq.com.
So I've got a question that came in about distributed teams. So the question was, what about distributed teams? Can this be done over the phone? As you'll see from the images that we presented, release planning ideally takes the whole team and brings them together face-to-face so that they can interact. And a lot of these examples were teams that are in different locations. Now, you saw the one of a team that participated with a couple representatives through a video, which was powerful, not the same as having them in person. But what we did accomplish was they had part of the team from each of those different locations come and attend the event. And so there was representation of the team in each room. But there was an individual who couldn't attend for personal reasons or travel because they were from outside the country. And so those participants came in through a video link. But they were able to communicate with members of their team who were in the room and ensure that their involvement was as close to face-to-face as possible. You know, we just did a big release plan, Valerie and I, that involved a program that had over 300 participants. And so trying to get everybody to come to one facility was just, it was impossible. So in that case, what was done as well was each team was sort of on standby and participated remotely. And we had more than 60 people come with representation from each team to attend and participate. And then they were at times leaving the room to go sync up with their teams through video or telephone. And so that allowed us to get the best representation that we could. And you know, the challenge here is you're expecting a commitment to come out of that event. You know, that everybody can buy in and say, yes, this is a good plan. And not being there really hinders that process. So if you're saving your budget, the time to spend it is when you can bring the best group together, all if possible, to accomplish release planning.
So I have a question. How to choose a facilitator, or how can I prep to do this by myself? Well, one way is to use some of the information that we provided today. It'll give you a high-level framework of how you can approach a release planning event and some of the tips and things to watch out for. The way that I learned how to do release planning was I actually went and shadowed some other events outside of my company at the time before I was with Solutions IQ to get an idea of what to expect and some of the planning that I would need to do with that. And then the last option that I'll offer out is to actually bring in a facilitator or a coach and have them pair with you, and the two of you do it together so that it's not just you sitting back watching somebody do it.
I've got one that came in. So you talked about using a definition of done. Why would a common definition of done be used where you've got multiple teams that release planning? So this would mean, I'm assuming that every team has already created their own definition of done, and now that we're planning together, how do we bring those together? So I think that's critical. How are we going to deliver collectively across multiple teams that are working on the various features of our product? How are we going to bring that work together and integrate it? And for that reason, I like to help the teams consider their respective definitions of done, and also plan for, besides the definition of done at the sprint level, how are we going to complete this work before the end of the sprint? I also want them thinking about how are we going to, what's our definition of done for a release, for example? What activities do we need to accomplish collectively to ensure that we have that plan? And even do a work back schedule about if this is the date we want to release, what activities and how do they line up and what are their durations? and ensure that each team is planning for that. And I want that common understanding as they go forward into the release planning event. I've got one also on prepping and estimating backlogs. So say teams have prepared their backlogs and then they need to integrate their backlogs, as you discussed in this release planning webinar. So what about all those estimates that the respective teams have planned? So this question again assumes the teams have prepped their backlogs independently perhaps, and then we're coming together to deliver this product, and so we're integrating those plans through the release planning process. So you've got teams with different estimates. How do we estimate together? So we often use a joint estimating meeting to sort of define some common, what we call them, Valerie, some common
language and understanding of what the teams need individually, but then when they come together as a whole, because they're going to be delivering together.
Right, and then we can use reference stories so that they can understand what is a large story for you guys, what is a large story for us, and then they can start to estimate. And it becomes important to estimate through the full backlog that's expected for the release so that they can complete the release planning process. Here's one that came in also. Are there any suggestions for capacity or workload in balancing for the development teams that are going to work on multiple projects? So what I like to do when we do release planning, or even at the iteration level, is to ensure that the teams aren't planning for 100% of the time available, but that they plan for those uncertainties. Maybe the team is supporting some maintenance items on a previous release as well as developing the new release, and I have them estimate a budget of hours and set that aside. So I would do the same at the release planning level. What other activities besides the development of these items that are on the planning wall are going to need to be completed? I'd also be looking, besides the calendaring as we showed, what days might we not all be here, who's on vacation, who's not fully committed on the project, what specialty resources do we have that are shared, and I'd want to consider those as well. And then teams aren't 100% efficient, so I'd be looking to teams to understand, if we're trying to understand how much work we can accomplish in establishing our velocity, more or less what percentage of the time are we able to focus on our work and consider that. So I think the best tool is to look at that historical velocity, talk about what we have been able to accomplish on our team, and use that as a yardstick really as we walk the wall and think about where we might get to in the future.
So we have another question, which is, what if other teams that you're doing release planning with don't do Agile practices or Scrum, etc.? They're still doing waterfall. Well, one of the things that we noticed in this example that Brian gave earlier about a release planning event with the 60+ people that we just did was that it was a mix of lots of different ways to get work done. And what we found was that the folks that weren't necessarily doing Agile practices or on Scrum teams, if you will, were very happy that they were invited to the table to talk about what they do and why they do it the way they do it. So in this process that we've talked about, there's nothing in here that is specifically related to just an Agile type situation. We talk about how much work can people get done over a certain period of time. We talk about what are key dates. We talk about issues, risks. We talk about what are the dependencies across teams. So I don't think this is a time to try to convert people necessarily to working one way or the other, but it is a time to come together as a larger team effort and really talk about what you need to get done over a scope and a timeline perspective.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you for attending today's webinar. Following this presentation, participants will receive an email with links to a recorded version and copies of today's slides to pass on to your colleagues. We'd like to thank MH and Version 1 for hosting this webinar and invite you all to check out the other cool features on their site. Thank you and have a great day.